She was suspended for risky flying until she saved 200 lives mid-flight. Aviation authorities condemned her aggressive techniques as dangerous and reckless. But when a Boeing 787 lost all controls over the Pacific Ocean, her risky methods were the only thing standing between passengers and certain death. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The suspension letter had arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, its official Federal Aviation Administration letterhead making Captain Rachel Kovac's hands tremble as she read the words that ended her career. Following comprehensive review of multiple incidents involving unauthorized flight maneuvers, excessive risk-taking, and repeated violations of standard operating procedures, the Aviation Safety Board hereby suspends the pilot license of Captain Rachel Kovac for a period of 24 months. The board has determined that Captain Kovac's pattern of aggressive flying demonstrates judgment incompatible with commercial aviation safety requirements and poses unacceptable risk to aircraft and passengers. The clinical language couldn't disguise what they were really saying, that she was reckless, dangerous, a pilot who thought the rules didn't apply to her. Now, 8 months after that devastating letter, Rachel sat in seat 17F of Transcontinental Airways Flight 394, watching other passengers settle in for the 11-hour journey from San Francisco to Tokyo. The Boeing 787 was state-of-the-art, its sophisticated systems representing everything modern aviation had become, automated, procedural, designed to minimize human intervention in favor of computerized precision. Rachel stared at the safety card in the seat pocket, feeling the bitter irony of being reduced to a passenger on a route she had flown dozens of times before her world collapsed. The incidents that destroyed her career played endlessly in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. 14 months ago, approaching SeaTac during severe crosswinds that had already forced 3 aircraft to divert, she had executed what the investigation report termed an aggressive sideslip maneuver exceeding safe bank angle parameters for passenger operations. What they hadn't acknowledged was that her technique, learned during combat deployments flying C-130s into hot zones under fire, had allowed her to maintain controlled flight when standard crosswind procedures would have forced a dangerous go-around in deteriorating weather. All 247 passengers had landed safely, but the flight data recorder showed bank angles that exceeded commercial operating limits, and that was enough for the safety board to flag her file with a warning about cowboy flying. The second incident had been worse. During a routine flight to Atlanta, her Boeing 757 had suffered a complete electrical failure at 37,000 feet, every primary flight instrument going dark in an instant. Standard procedures called for switching to backup systems and beginning an immediate descent while working through emergency checklists. But Rachel had recognized immediately that the electrical failure had also compromised their backup systems, leaving them flying blind with only basic mechanical instruments that most modern pilots had never trained on. In the 8 minutes before partial electrical power was restored, she had hand-flown the aircraft using techniques from her military career, using engine sounds, airframe vibrations, and instinctive feel to maintain controlled flight while working the problem. She had saved everyone aboard through skills that civilian training programs didn't teach, but the investigation focused on what they called unauthorized deviation from emergency procedures and failure to declare emergency immediately. The fact that immediate emergency declaration would have triggered controller instructions she couldn't follow with dead radios meant nothing to regulators who measured safety and procedural compliance rather than actual outcomes. But it was the final incident that had sealed her grounding, the one that aviation safety officials cited as proof that Rachel Kovac was too dangerous to fly commercial aircraft. 6 months after the electrical failure, her Boeing 767 had experienced catastrophic hydraulic loss during approach to Denver, every hydraulic system simultaneously failing in a cascade that left her with no flight controls except engine thrust. She had 12 minutes to figure out how to land a 200-ton aircraft that wouldn't respond to normal control inputs, 12 minutes before fuel exhaustion would turn them into a falling brick. Standard procedures for total hydraulic failure called for attempting to maintain wings-level flight while working toward any survivable outcome, accepting that controlled landing might be impossible. Rachel had done something that civilian aviation had never seen before. Using techniques she had developed during classified test pilot work with experimental aircraft, she had flown the crippled 767 using only differential engine thrust, adding power to one engine and reducing it on another to create turning forces, using subtle throttle movements to control pitch, essentially reinventing flight control on the fly. For 12 eternal minutes, she had coaxed that broken aircraft through maneuvers that should have been impossible, maintaining controlled flight while descending toward Denver International. The landing had been brutal, too fast, too hard, blowing multiple tires and causing minor injuries to several passengers, but everyone had survived a situation that every aviation expert agreed should have killed them all. The Aviation Safety Board had been merciless in their review. Captain Kovac's decision to attempt controlled flight using engine thrust alone, rather than following established procedures for catastrophic control failure, created unnecessary additional risk. Her aggressive maneuvering exceeded all safety parameters and demonstrated a dangerous pattern of believing her skills place her above standard protocols. While the outcome was fortunate, her methods cannot be condoned. They had suspended her license and recommended psychological evaluation, suggesting that her military background had made her unsuitable for civilian operations where passenger safety required adherence to procedures rather than individual heroics. Her airline had terminated her employment the day the suspension was announced. Fellow pilots who had once respected her now avoided her in crew lounges, treating her like a cautionary tale about what happened when ego overcame judgment. Aviation message boards debated her grounding, with most pilots agreeing that the suspension was justified, that someone who couldn't follow procedures had no business commanding commercial aircraft, that her cowboy mentality endangered everyone, that her military experience had given her dangerous confidence in her ability to fly outside normal parameters. Only a handful of voices defended her, mostly former military pilots who understood that some situations demanded capabilities beyond civilian training, but they were drowned out by the consensus that Rachel Kovac deserved to be grounded. She had spent 8 months in mandatory psychological counseling, enduring sessions with aviation psychologists who probed for evidence of the risk-taking personality they were certain she possessed. She had worked temporary jobs that paid a fraction of what she had earned as a captain, watching her savings dwindle while legal bills mounted from her attempts to appeal the suspension. She had maintained quiet dignity throughout, never publicly defending her techniques or explaining that her risky flying represented 15 years of military aviation experience that included combat deployments, experimental test flights, and tactical situations where conventional procedures meant death. She had learned to fly in environments where the aircraft manual was a starting point rather than absolute law, where survival demanded understanding aircraft behavior at levels that civilian training never explored. Now she was reduced to being a passenger, sitting in economy class on a flight that would take her to Tokyo where she had a job interview with a cargo airline desperate enough to consider a grounded pilot. Around her, travelers settled into the routine of a long international flight, parents trying to keep children entertained, business travelers opening laptops, tourists already sleeping in preparation for crossing time zones. None of them knew that the woman in 17F had once been one of the most skilled pilots in commercial aviation, or that aviation authorities had decided those skills made her too dangerous to fly. Flight 394 pushed back from the gate at 10:43 p.m. Pacific Time, the massive Rolls-Royce engine spooling up with the precise efficiency that made the 787 one of the most advanced aircraft in the sky. Rachel felt the familiar sensations of taxi and takeoff with the bittersweet recognition of someone experiencing something they loved from the wrong perspective. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, Captain James Peterson and First Officer Amanda Chen executing a textbook departure that would have satisfied the most demanding examiner. Everything was perfect, exactly the kind of by-the-book flying that aviation authorities loved. 3 hours into the flight, Rachel woke from restless sleep with the immediate alertness that military training had ingrained in her nervous system. Something had changed in the aircraft's behavior, a subtle shift that probably wasn't noticeable to the other passengers but that triggered every instinct developed through thousands of flight hours. She sat up straighter, her senses fully engaged, listening to the engine harmonics and feeling the airframe's vibrations through her seat. The aircraft was flying normally by all obvious measures, but something felt wrong in a way she couldn't immediately identify. The seatbelt sign illuminated with its soft chime, and Captain Peterson's voice came over the public address system with the practiced calm that commercial pilots use to avoid alarming passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering some weather ahead that may cause turbulence. Please return to your seats and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. It was a routine announcement, the kind passengers heard on almost every flight, but Rachel noticed the slight tension in Peterson's voice that suggested this was more than routine chop. She looked out the window into the darkness and saw something that made her blood run cold. Lightning flickered through towering clouds that rose far above their cruising altitude of 39,000 feet, illuminating massive thunderstorm cells that shouldn't have been there. The weather briefing would have shown these storms, would have allowed the pilots to route around them. But weather in the Pacific could develop with terrifying speed, and sometimes the safest route was between cells rather than trying to circumnavigate systems that stretched for hundreds of miles. Flight 394 entered the first cell, and immediately Rachel felt the aircraft begin to buck in turbulence that was far more severe than Peterson's announcement had suggested. Around her, passengers gasped and grabbed armrests as the 787 dropped suddenly, caught in a downdraft that felt like an elevator cable snapping. The aircraft climbed back up just as violently, the forces pressing Rachel down into her seat before releasing her against her seatbelt. This wasn't normal turbulence, this was convective activity that could tear aircraft apart if they stayed in it too long. Through the bulkhead separating the passenger cabin from the cockpit, Rachel heard the subtle change in engine sounds that told her Peterson was adjusting power and altitude, trying to find smoother air. But the turbulence was only getting worse, the aircraft now experiencing continuous jolts that sent overhead bins popping open and luggage tumbling into the aisles. A flight attendant stumbled past Rachel's seat, her face showing barely controlled fear as she struggled toward her station. Other passengers were crying out in terror as the aircraft pitched and rolled in the grip of atmospheric forces that exceeded anything in normal operations. Without warning, every light in the aircraft went out. Not just the cabin lights, but everything, the reading lights, the galley equipment indicators, the emergency exit signs. For 3 eternal seconds, Flight 394 was completely dark except for the lightning flashes illuminating terrified faces. Then the emergency lighting system activated, bathing the cabin in the eerie red glow that signaled electrical system failure. Rachel's trained mind immediately understood what had happened. They had suffered a lightning strike that had overwhelmed the electrical system, and they were now flying on backup power that might not last long. The public address system crackled with static, and Peterson's voice came through with an edge of controlled panic that he couldn't quite conceal. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing. Passengers, remain seated and follow all crew instructions. We are experiencing technical difficulties and will be diverting to the nearest suitable airport. But Rachel knew they were nowhere near a suitable airport. They were over the North Pacific, at least 1,500 miles from land in any direction, flying through storms that would make any emergency descent incredibly dangerous. She felt the aircraft begin to descend, the pilots following their training to get down to an altitude where they could potentially ditch if systems continued to fail. But something was wrong with the descent, the nose angle was too steep, the rate too high, suggesting that Peterson and Chen were fighting compromised flight controls in addition to the electrical problems. Rachel recognized the signs of pilots discovering that their emergency was far worse than initial indications suggested, that multiple systems had failed in ways that cascaded beyond normal emergency procedures. A man in the seat beside her grabbed Rachel's arm, his face pale with terror. "What's happening? Are we going to crash?" She forced her voice to remain calm even as her mind raced through scenarios. "The pilots are handling an electrical problem. Modern aircraft have multiple backup systems. Try to stay calm." But she knew they were in serious trouble, the kind of compound emergency that exceeded normal training and threatened everyone aboard. The aircraft lurched violently to the left, and Rachel heard the characteristic sound of engines surging, power fluctuating wildly as the electronic engine control system struggled with the electrical damage. They were descending through 35,000 feet in deteriorating weather with failing electrical systems, unstable engines, and flight controls that weren't responding properly. It was the perfect storm of failures, each problem amplifying the others, creating a situation that would challenge even the most experienced crew. Through the darkness and confusion, Rachel heard a flight attendant speaking urgently into the interphone near the forward galley. The attendant's face showed the kind of fear that came from receiving information from the cockpit that wasn't being shared with passengers. Rachel unbuckled and moved forward despite the violent motion of the aircraft, knowing she had to understand what was really happening. She reached the attendant and identified herself quietly. "I'm Captain Rachel Kovac. I'm a pilot, grounded, but trained for emergencies." "What are the pilots reporting?" The flight attendant's eyes widened with recognition and desperate hope. "You're the pilot who saved that plane in Denver. The one they grounded for risky flying?" Rachel nodded tersely. "What's the situation?" The attendant's voice dropped to a whisper that barely carried over the aircraft's groaning protest. "Multiple electrical failures, both hydraulic systems showing pressure loss, engines running rough, and the captain says the flight controls feel wrong, like they're not responding to inputs properly. They're trying to reach an altitude where we can ditch if necessary, but the weather is making it almost impossible to control the aircraft." Rachel felt ice settle into her stomach as she processed the catastrophic combination of failures. Lightning strike had damaged electrical systems, which had affected the fly-by-wire flight controls, which had somehow compromised hydraulic systems, and now they were dealing with engine problems from the electrical damage. It was a cascade failure that would overwhelm standard emergency procedures, exactly the kind of situation where conventional training became inadequate and where capabilities beyond normal parameters meant the difference between survival and catastrophic loss. She made a decision that would either save everyone or get her prosecuted for violating her suspension. "Tell the captain that Rachel Kovac is aboard. Tell him I've handled compound emergencies like this before, and I can help if they need it." The flight attendant stared at her for a moment, then grabbed the interphone and relayed the message. 30 seconds later, the cockpit door opened, and First Officer Chen appeared, her face showing the exhaustion and terror of someone fighting a losing battle. "Captain Kovac. Captain Peterson says to get up here immediately. We're out of options." Rachel pushed into the cockpit and immediately understood why Peterson had called for her despite her grounded status. Every multifunction display showed cascading amber and red warnings, the sophisticated flight deck transformed into a Christmas tree of system failures. Peterson's hands were white-knuckled on the yoke, fighting to maintain control of an aircraft that was bucking and rolling like a wounded animal. Chen was working through emergency checklists with the desperate speed of someone who knew they were running out of time and options. "Captain Kovac," Peterson gasped without taking his eyes off the instruments. "I know you're grounded. I know they suspended you for aggressive flying. But we're in an unrecoverable situation here. Lightning strike took out primary electrical, we've lost both hydraulic systems, engines are surging, and the flight controls feel like they're going to separate completely. I've got 200 souls aboard and maybe 10 minutes before this aircraft tears itself apart or falls out of the sky. Whatever techniques got you grounded, I need them now." Rachel dropped into the observer's seat and scanned the instruments with the focused intensity of someone trained to process complex emergencies in seconds. The situation was even worse than she had feared. The fly-by-wire system that translated pilot inputs into flight control movements was degraded to the point of being nearly useless, leaving them with only mechanical backup systems that were never designed to handle the full control authority needed in these conditions. Both hydraulic systems showed pressure dropping towards zero, which meant the flight control surfaces would soon be completely unresponsive. The engines were running but showing wildly fluctuating power due to damaged electronic controls. And they were still in severe turbulence that was making it almost impossible to maintain controlled flight even with functioning systems. "How long until complete hydraulic failure?" Rachel asked, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute clarity. Chen checked her displays. 4 minutes. Maybe 5 if we're lucky. Once we lose hydraulic pressure completely, we'll have no flight controls except whatever we can do with engine thrust. Peterson threw her a desperate glance. "That's what you did over Denver, right? Flew the aircraft using only engines. Can you do it again?" Rachel's mind was already racing through the calculations and techniques she would need. "What I did over Denver was land a 767 at a major airport in good weather using engine thrust. You're asking me to fly a 787 through a Pacific storm with 200 passengers using a technique I've only done once before in completely different conditions. The 787's engines are positioned differently, the aircraft has different weight distribution, and we're in weather that makes precision control almost impossible. She paused, meeting Peterson's terrified gaze. But it's the only chance we have. You need to let me fly this aircraft using methods that violate every procedure in your manual. Peterson made the hardest decision of his career without hesitation. She's yours, Captain Kovac. Tell us what to do. Rachel slid into the left seat as Peterson moved to the observer position, her hands finding the controls with the familiar sense of connection that defined her relationship with aircraft. She could feel immediately what Peterson had been fighting. The controls were mushy, unresponsive, giving the sickening sensation of commanding an aircraft that wasn't listening. They were descending through 28,000 feet in turbulence that was slamming them around with forces that exceeded design limits. First thing we do is stop fighting the weather, Rachel said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had faced impossible situations before. Pull the power back to flight idle on all engines. Yes, I know that sounds insane, but we need to slow down and let this aircraft find its own stability instead of trying to force it through the turbulence. Chen's hands moved toward the throttles, then hesitated. Flight idle in these conditions? We'll lose altitude fast, and if we stall, Rachel cut her off. If we keep fighting at this airspeed, we'll tear the wings off. Trust me. Peterson nodded at Chen, and she pulled all 4 throttles to flight idle. The aircraft immediately began to slow, and simultaneously the violent bucking started to smooth as they stopped trying to muscle their way through the storm. Rachel felt the aircraft's behavior change, the aerodynamic forces finding a new equilibrium that was unstable but manageable. They were descending at 2,000 feet per minute, but the turbulence was decreasing as they dropped below the most severe convective activity. Now we're going to use a technique that doesn't exist in any civilian manual, Rachel continued, her hands making subtle inputs that Peterson and Chen had never seen before. We're going to fly this aircraft using thrust vectoring and differential power to create control forces. When I need to turn left, I'll add power to the right engines and reduce it on the left. When I need to pitch up, I'll increase power on the wing engines. It's like flying a helicopter where every control input is actually an engine adjustment. The key is being gentle and predictive. We're not commanding the aircraft, we're suggesting what we want it to do and letting physics do the work. She demonstrated by adding slight power to engines 3 and 4 while reducing power on 1 and 2. The aircraft began a gentle turn to the left, responding to the differential thrust with the ponderous grace of a ship changing course. Peterson watched in fascination and horror as Rachel commanded the broken aircraft using nothing but engine power, creating control moments that shouldn't have been possible. How did you learn this? He breathed. Military test pilot work, Rachel said shortly. Flying aircraft that were designed to fail so we could understand edge-of-envelope behavior. You learn that every aircraft wants to fly, you just have to find the right way to ask it. The hydraulic failure warning sounded as the last pressure bled out of both systems, and now they were truly flying with no conventional controls. The yoke in front of Rachel was completely limp, connected to flight control surfaces that couldn't move without hydraulic pressure. She was flying a 200-ton aircraft using only the 4 engines, maintaining controlled flight through a technique that most pilots didn't know existed and that aviation authorities had determined was too risky for commercial operations. We're through 15,000 feet, Chen reported, her voice shaking slightly. Weather is improving as we descend, but we're still in cloud and we have no radar because of the electrical damage. We're flying blind. Rachel nodded, her hands making constant micro-adjustments to the throttles. Captain Peterson, I need you on the radio. Try to reach any station and declare an emergency. We need to know where the nearest suitable water is for ditching because that's where we're heading. This aircraft is not going to make it to land. The word ditching sent a chill through the cockpit. Ditching a commercial airliner in the Pacific at night in rough seas was one of the most dangerous maneuvers in aviation, with survival rates that were historically terrible. But Rachel was already calculating the best approach, running through techniques she had practiced in simulators but never executed in reality. The key to successful ditching was controlling the descent rate and touchdown attitude precisely, exactly the kind of precision that would be nearly impossible when flying with engine thrust alone. Peterson worked the radio, finally raising a military frequency that connected him to a Navy vessel that was monitoring the area. Coast Guard is coordinating search and rescue, Peterson reported after several minutes of rapid communication. Nearest Navy ship is the USS Michael Murphy, approximately 200 miles southwest of our current position. They're heading toward us at flank speed, but it'll still take them hours to reach ditching coordinates. They're asking if we can maintain controlled flight until daylight. Rachel checked the fuel quantity, doing quick mental math. We've got maybe 90 minutes of fuel remaining at our current power settings. Dawn is still 5 hours away. We're going down in darkness. She felt the weight of 200 lives pressing on her shoulders, knowing that every decision she made in the next hour would determine whether those people lived or died. This was why she had become a pilot, not for the routine flights between cities, but for moments like this when skill and courage were the only things standing between passengers and catastrophe. We're going to use the remaining time to get this aircraft into the best possible condition for ditching, Rachel said, her voice carrying the calm confidence that people needed to hear in crisis situations. First Officer Chen, work with the cabin crew to prepare passengers for water landing. Life vests on, emergency exits reviewed, everyone in brace position when we make our final approach. Captain Peterson, you're going to help me fly this aircraft. I'll maintain control using the throttles, but I need you watching altitude, airspeed, and attitude. Call out any deviations because I can't afford to look at instruments, I need to feel this aircraft. They descended through 10,000 feet, breaking out of the clouds into a nightmare seascape of towering waves and driving rain illuminated by lightning. The Pacific was angry tonight, the storm that had damaged their aircraft also churning the ocean into chaos. Rachel assessed the conditions and felt her stomach tighten. Ditching in these seas would be like landing on a moving parking lot, with waves that could tear the aircraft apart if they hit wrong. We need to find calmer water, she said, scanning the darkness for any break in the storm. Those waves are 20 feet at least. If we hit one at the wrong angle, we'll cartwheel. She used gentle power adjustments to turn the aircraft, following her instincts toward an area where the lightning seemed less intense. For 20 minutes they flew through the storm at 5,000 feet, Rachel coaxing the broken aircraft through turns that were agonizingly slow but remarkably controlled given that they had no flight controls beyond engine power. There, Peterson said suddenly, pointing ahead. Lightning is showing a break in the weather. Might indicate a gap between storm cells. Rachel adjusted their course, and gradually the conditions began to improve. The rain eased, the wind steadied, and when lightning illuminated the ocean surface, they could see that the waves were smaller, still dangerous, but possibly survivable. This is as good as it's going to get, Rachel said, checking their fuel. They had maybe 30 minutes remaining, just enough for one approach to ditching. There would be no second chances, no go-around option. She would get one opportunity to put this aircraft down in conditions that would challenge even the most skilled pilots with fully functional controls, and she would have to do it using only engine thrust to maintain control. It was impossible by every standard of conventional aviation, but impossible was what Rachel Kovac had been doing her entire career. Rachel descended the aircraft to 1,000 feet, flying a wide pattern that would bring them aligned with the wind and waves for the final approach. Every fiber of her being was focused on the task ahead, reading the ocean surface in lightning flashes, feeling the aircraft's response to her throttle inputs, calculating speeds and descent rates in her head because the instruments were degraded and unreliable. She had landed aircraft in combat zones under fire, had tested experimental planes at the edge of controllability, had flown missions that would have terrified most pilots. But this was different. This was 200 innocent people trusting her with their lives, depending on techniques that aviation authorities had deemed too risky for commercial operations. Cabin is secure, Chen reported, her voice tight with suppressed fear. Passengers are in brace position, life vests on, emergency exits manned by flight attendants. The cabin crew knows this is a one-shot approach. Rachel nodded, her hands never leaving the throttles. She was flying now by pure instinct, using skills that went beyond training or procedures into a realm where pilot and aircraft merged into a single entity. The 787 was broken, barely controllable, minutes from running out of fuel. But it was still an aircraft, still subject to the laws of physics, still capable of responding to someone who understood those laws at a fundamental level. "I'm going to talk you through what I'm doing," Rachel said, her voice carrying the teaching tone of a combat instructor preparing students for situations beyond normal training. "We're going to descend at 300 feet per minute, slow enough to control precisely, fast enough to reach the surface before we run out of fuel. I'll maintain 140 knots airspeed using differential power to create drag when needed. At 100 feet, I'll begin a flare by adding power to all engines symmetrically. The goal is to touch down nose up but not too high, on the back of a wave swell but not on the crest. If we get it right, we'll slide to a stop and have maybe 60 seconds to evacuate before we sink." Peterson stared at her in awe and terror. "You're talking about landing a 787 on ocean swells at night with no flight controls within a margin of error measured in feet. Captain Kovac, what you're describing is impossible." Rachel allowed herself a grim smile. "Impossible is what they grounded me for being good at. Call out my altitude and airspeed. It's time to show the Aviation Safety Board what risky flying really means." She began the final descent, her hands working the throttles with micro-precise movements that kept the aircraft tracking straight despite the complete lack of normal flight controls. The ocean rushed up toward them, visible in lightning flashes that illuminated a chaotic surface of wind-whipped waves and foam. Rachel ignored everything except the relationship between aircraft and sea, feeling for the perfect moment to transition from descent to flare. 500 feet, Peterson called out. Airspeed 140 knots. Descent rate 300 feet per minute. You're perfectly on profile. Rachel made a tiny power adjustment on engine 2 to counteract a slight drift to the left. The aircraft responded sluggishly but predictably, exactly as she had calculated. Her entire world had narrowed to throttles and ocean and the precise coordination needed to merge the two successfully. 300 feet, speed 138. You're drifting right slightly. Rachel added fractional power to engine 3, feeling the aircraft respond. She was reading the wind now by how it affected their track, making constant small corrections that kept them aligned with the wave pattern. A technique she had learned flying low-level tactical missions in gusty desert conditions, adapted now to a situation that civilian aviation had never anticipated. 200 feet. The ocean surface was clearly visible now, even without lightning. Rachel could see individual wave crests, could judge their height and spacing. She picked her target, a section where the swells were slightly lower and more regular. That was where they would touch down, assuming she could control their descent precisely enough to hit a specific point on a moving target while flying an aircraft that shouldn't be controllable at all. 100 feet, beginning flare. Rachel pushed all 4 throttles forward smoothly, feeling the engines respond with increased power that fought their descent rate. The aircraft's nose wanted to pitch up with the power increase, but without elevator control, she had to use the thrust vector from the engines to create the pitch moment. She had calculated the exact power setting needed, too little and they would hit too hard, too much and they would balloon up and stall. The margin for error was non-existent. 50 feet, speed 135. Descent rate decreasing. Peterson's voice was amazingly steady given that they were seconds from impact. Rachel made one final power adjustment, trying to time their touchdown for the back of a swell that would cushion the impact. The ocean filled her vision, black water and white foam rushing toward them with terrifying speed. "Brace for impact," she shouted, and then the aircraft hit the water. The impact was brutal but controlled, the aft fuselage touching first exactly as Rachel had planned. The water's resistance created massive deceleration forces that threw everyone forward against their restraints. The aircraft bounced once, slamming down again as the nose touched water, then began the long hydroplane slide that Rachel had calculated would dissipate their forward momentum. She kept her hands on the throttles, ready to add power if needed to prevent them from nosing into the water, but the aircraft was tracking straight and slowing smoothly. They slid to a stop, and suddenly there was silence except for the pounding of waves against the fuselage. They were floating, the 787 sealed pressure vessel acting as a huge boat that would keep them on the surface for perhaps 2 minutes before flooding and sinking. Rachel was already moving, years of emergency training taking over. Emergency evacuation. Flight attendants deploy slides. She heard the cabin doors opening, heard the explosive deployment of emergency slides that would serve as life rafts once they separated from the aircraft. She turned to Peterson and Chen, both of whom were staring at her in stunned disbelief. "You just landed a commercial airliner on the Pacific Ocean using only engine thrust," Peterson said, his voice shaking. "With no flight controls, in storm conditions, at night. Captain Kovac, I've been flying for 22 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did." Rachel was already moving toward the cockpit door. "Save the congratulations until everyone is off this aircraft. We've got about 90 seconds before she goes down." The evacuation was chaotic but amazingly efficient, passengers sliding down the inflated rafts into the Pacific while flight attendants maintained order and accounted for everyone. The Navy had deployed search and rescue helicopters that were already arriving overhead, their searchlights illuminating the scene with surreal clarity. Rachel was the last person off Flight 394, jumping onto a life raft 60 seconds before the aircraft's nose dipped below the surface and the Boeing 787 began its final descent into 15,000 feet of Pacific water. The rescue operation took 4 hours, with Navy helicopters lifting passengers and crew from life rafts onto the deck of the USS Michael Murphy. Not a single person had died. Some passengers had minor injuries from the impact, a few had hypothermia from being in the water, but everyone had survived an emergency that should have killed them all. When Rachel climbed aboard the helicopter for her ride to the ship, the Navy rescue swimmer who helped her aboard recognized her from news coverage of her grounding. "Ma'am, I heard what you did. That was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever seen, and I've been doing rescue operations for 12 years. Aboard the Michael Murphy, Rachel stood wrapped in blankets while Navy medical personnel checked her for injuries. Captain Peterson found her on the flight deck, watching dawn break over the Pacific. "Captain Kovac, I need to tell you something before the investigators arrive and this becomes official. What you did tonight, those techniques that got you grounded, you saved 200 lives using skills that I didn't know existed. The Aviation Safety Board was wrong about you. Completely, catastrophically wrong. The investigation began within hours, FAA officials arriving aboard the ship via helicopter with expressions that mixed shock at the successful ditching with uncertainty about how to handle a grounded pilot who had just accomplished the impossible. The senior investigator, a man named Director William Chen who had been part of the board that suspended Rachel's license, looked physically ill as he listened to Peterson and First Officer Chen describe what had happened in the cockpit. "Let me make sure I understand," Director Chen said slowly. Captain Kovac, while serving a suspension for risky flying, took control of an aircraft experiencing multiple catastrophic failures and flew it for over an hour with no hydraulic systems, degraded electrical power, and no conventional flight controls. She then ditched the aircraft at night in storm conditions using only engine thrust for control, landing on ocean swells with precision sufficient to allow complete evacuation before sinking. He looked at Rachel with an expression that mixed disbelief with dawning comprehension. "And not a single person died." First Officer Amanda Chen spoke up fiercely. "Director Chen, Captain Kovac's techniques were the only reason anyone survived. Captain Peterson and I were following every standard emergency procedure perfectly, and we were 30 seconds from crashing into the Pacific when she took over. Everything in our training said her methods were impossible, flying without flight controls, using only engines for directional and pitch control, landing on water at night. But she did it because she has skills that go beyond conventional aviation training. Skills that your board grounded her for possessing." The media coverage of Flight 394's miraculous ditching began spreading within hours of the rescue. Passengers told stories of watching their pilot struggle unsuccessfully with the emergency until a grounded pilot had stepped in with techniques that seemed impossible. Several passengers were aviation professionals themselves, including 2 airline pilots who provided technical commentary that explained just how remarkable Rachel's flying had been. One of them, a 777 captain with 30 years of experience, told reporters, "What Captain Kovac did was beyond anything in commercial aviation training. She flew a broken aircraft through conditions that should have been unsurvivable using techniques that exist at the intersection of experimental test flying, combat aviation, and pure instinct." The Aviation Safety Board grounded her for possessing exactly the capabilities that saved everyone aboard. Boeing's engineering team spent weeks analyzing data from the salvaged flight data recorder that Navy divers recovered from the sunken aircraft. Their report was extraordinary, a technical analysis of how Rachel had maintained controlled flight with systems that were degraded beyond anything the aircraft was designed to handle. The report noted that her use of differential engine thrust to create control moments was theoretically sound but practically impossible without extensive experience in edge-of-envelope flight testing, and that her ability to land precisely on ocean swells represented situational awareness and aircraft control skills at the extreme upper end of pilot capabilities. The Aviation Safety Board held emergency hearings to review Rachel's suspension in light of what had happened. Director Chen, visibly uncomfortable, addressed the board with an admission that was unprecedented in aviation regulatory history. This board grounded Captain Rachel Kovac for what we termed risky flying, for using aggressive techniques that exceeded standard operating procedures. Upon review of her actions aboard Flight 394, we now understand that what we called risky flying represents advanced emergency capabilities that conventional training does not address. Captain Kovac's military background gave her skills that most commercial pilots will never develop, the ability to fly aircraft beyond certified limits, to maintain control in impossible conditions, to execute maneuvers that we didn't even know were possible. He looked directly at Rachel, who sat in the hearing room with quiet dignity. "Captain Kovac, on behalf of the Aviation Safety Board, I apologize. Your suspension was based on our failure to recognize that some situations exceed standard procedures, that there are emergencies which require capabilities beyond conventional training. Your risky flying saved 287 passengers over Denver, brought down a crippled aircraft safely in 3 separate emergencies, and kept 200 people alive in conditions that should have killed everyone. The board votes unanimously to reverse your suspension and reinstate your license with a formal commendation for extraordinary airmanship." But the vindication went far beyond the reversal of her suspension. The FAA established a new training program based on Rachel's techniques, bringing together military test pilots and combat aviators to teach commercial pilots about aircraft behavior beyond normal parameters. Rachel herself became the program director, developing curricula that bridged the gap between by-the-book civilian flying and the edge-of-envelope capabilities that extreme emergencies sometimes demanded. She taught hundreds of pilots that the procedures in the manual were essential for normal operations but that true airmanship meant understanding when situations exceeded those procedures and having the skills to fly beyond them. Her airline not only reinstated her but promoted her to chief pilot of training, responsible for developing the next generation of pilots who would understand that safety came not from blind adherence to checklists but from deep understanding of aircraft capabilities. She flew as a line captain again too, commanding flights with the confidence of someone who had been tested in the most extreme conditions and had proven that her controversial techniques represented genuine mastery rather than reckless abandon. On the first anniversary of Flight 394's ditching, Rachel stood before an auditorium filled with aviation professionals at a safety conference, telling the story of that night over the Pacific. She described the cascading failures, the impossible conditions, the techniques that had kept everyone alive. But mostly she talked about the fundamental misunderstanding that had led to her grounding, the belief that following procedures was the same as being safe, that capabilities beyond normal training were risky rather than essential. "They grounded me for risky flying," Rachel said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent auditorium. "They said I was dangerous, that I took unnecessary chances, that I demonstrated poor judgment. But what they called risky flying was actually advanced airmanship developed through years of military experience flying in conditions that civilian aviation never imagines." When Flight 394 suffered multiple catastrophic failures over the Pacific, risky techniques were the only thing standing between 200 passengers and certain death. Every maneuver that got me grounded, the aggressive wind shear recovery, the unauthorized use of thrust vectoring, the continuation of takeoff with extreme control inputs, those weren't examples of poor judgment. They were examples of having skills that exceeded what conventional training provided. She paused, looking out at faces that included many of the officials who had suspended her license. The lesson isn't that procedures don't matter, they do. Standard operating procedures exist for excellent reasons and save lives every day. But the lesson is that we need to recognize when situations exceed procedures, when aircraft are flying beyond certified limits, when conventional training becomes inadequate. We need pilots who understand aircraft behavior at a fundamental level, who have experienced edge-of-envelope conditions, who possess capabilities that go beyond the checklist. That's not risky flying. That's what real airmanship looks like when everything goes wrong. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, pilots and regulators united in recognition that Rachel Kovac had fundamentally changed how aviation thought about emergency capabilities. She had been grounded for possessing skills that regulators didn't understand, suspended for techniques that exceeded conventional parameters, condemned for having capabilities that civilian training didn't provide. But she had proven through undeniable results that what they called risky flying represented expertise that was essential when faced with the impossible, that the most dangerous thing in aviation wasn't pilots who could fly beyond normal limits, but a regulatory system that couldn't recognize when those capabilities meant the difference between survival and catastrophe.